Passenger traveling by herself from Finland to New York City, a brave girl going to America. Unidentified for years until modern DNA technology. We found her name here on the passengers list. Gwen Lahainen, 23. Bedroom steward Charles Smith, married to Martha. They have 4 children. Martha also never remarried, and their youngest child lived to 2001. From the coast of Ireland, this is probably the last photo ever taken of her. Icebergs drift down from the north. A few hours after nightfall, racing through an ice field at 22 knots in the dark, the ship wasn't nimble enough to turn at the last second. A little over 700 made it into the 20 lifeboats, one floating upside down in the water. Over 1,500 didn't have a lifeboat. The Carpathia was the first ship to arrive, pulling in lifeboats and saving over 700 people. With 1,500 dead in the sea, the Halifax ship McKay Bennett arrived 8 days later due to bad weather and retrieved 300 bodies. But there was a problem. Canadian maritime law stated that bodies could only enter port if embalmed, so they did the embalming on the ship. Running out of supplies, they buried over 100 third-class passengers at sea. Second-class passengers were wrapped in canvas to be brought back. First-class passengers got coffins. Harold Reynolds was an interesting passenger. In the Army at 21, he was sick of it. Listed as a deserter, 2 days later he boarded the Titanic, hoping for a new life as a baker in Toronto with a friend already successful there. And if it's true that the band on the Titanic decided to play while the ship went down, this is the orchestra. This is Jock Yoon, the first violinist, and I'm standing right in front of his grave. Later, a bill arrived for John's band uniform. His father declined to pay it.
Recently, one of the children who was lost was identified. His entire family was lost at sea, but his burial was paid for by the sailors on the ship who actually found his little body.
This is erected to the memory of an unknown child whose remains were recovered after the disaster of the Titanic. Recently, they did DNA testing. His name was Sidney Leslie Goodwin, 1910 to 1912. The little boy's dad had received word of a new power station being built in Niagara Falls, New York, and possible work there. They booked passage for the whole family on another ship, but a coal strike delayed that vessel, and they were transferred to the Titanic. Traveling in third class, by the time they received the warning about abandoning ship, all lifeboats had been launched. There's 121 folks buried here. Nils Paulson had gone ahead to Chicago to save enough money for his family to come from Sweden to England and then to America on the Titanic. When the ship was sinking, for Alma by herself, it took too long to prepare the 4 children, something any parent has experienced, and they all came up too late for the lifeboats. An account says her husband's grief was the greatest of anyone who visited the White Star offices. As the crowd grew waiting for word, his whole family had been wiped out. Henry Allen, a fireman in the boiler room. His wife Cecilia was pregnant at the time of the sinking and gave birth to daughter Eliza. Edward Rogers was an assistant storekeeper. Henry Ash's wife gave birth to daughter Gladys. He was a Titanic steward. The character that Leonardo DiCaprio played in the movie, Jack Dawson, people think this is the character that he played. This is very often covered with pennies and little gifts. But this is Joseph Dawson, who worked in Titanic's boiler room as a coal trimmer. And there was one more thing we wanted to see at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. An actual Titanic deck chair. Imagine passengers relaxing on that on board. Found floating in the ocean, it has the engraved star of the White Star Line. This is almost definitely the iceberg that sunk the Titanic. 2 photos taken by different ships showing a large red streak of paint across the damaged iceberg. Robert Ballard found the Titanic wreck in 1985, but it was part of a cover-up mission for the Navy, now declassified. They asked him to find the wrecks of 2 nuclear American subs, the USS Thresher and USS Scorpion. But they didn't want the Russians to learn the nuclear locations. Searching for the Titanic would be the perfect cover story. Once he found the subs, he had only 12 days to enjoy his mission, searching for the Titanic. He found it 12,000 feet down. So many newspapers were wrong, saying all the passengers were saved and the Titanic was damaged but not sunk. As the Titanic radio operator sent out SOS and CQD, the closest ships were the SS California. Just 10 miles away, they had switched off their radio. Seeing signal rockets coming from the ship, they could have saved a lot of the passengers. The Samson, 10 miles away, had also seen Titanic signal rockets, but they were doing illegal seal hunting, so ship's officers decided to move on quickly to avoid detection. The Carpathia, 58 miles away, immediately sailed at top speed to be the first ship on the scene in just 3.5 hours. They saved over 700 people. 6 years later, the Carpathia was sunk by this German submarine. More intrigue, the Millionaire's lifeboat. Boat number 1 could hold 40 passengers, but left with only 12, 7 crew members and 5 first-class passengers that were quite wealthy. It was said Sir Cosmo and Lucy Duff Gordon gave the crew members money, who quickly rowed them away, ignoring people in the water. At the inquest afterwards, it was said Sir Cosmo had given each member of the lifeboat crew money the day after they arrived in New York. Now here in Nova Scotia is where the bodies arrived from the ship. This is the most excellent Mayflower Curling Club today, a nice and cold place. In 1912, at its original location just a few blocks away, the curling club was used as a cold morgue to store the bodies. There are beautiful postage stamps from all over the world that honor the Titanic disaster and victims. Almost nobody knows about the memorial to the Titanic in Washington, D.C. Put up in 1931, just a few blocks from Nationals Ballpark. It was moved in 1968 to 4th and P Street Southwest. It reads, to the brave men who perished in the wreck of the Titanic. They gave their lives that women and children might be saved. This is Titanic 2 being built right now by Blue Star Line. It'll be about the same size as Titanic, but with modern navigational equipment. So just like Jack and Rose, you two will be able to stand at the front and paint pictures of each other. Famous people who just missed the voyage. Guillermo Marconi, radio pioneer, was offered a free ticket but had work to do, so he took the Lusitania instead 3 days earlier. Milton Hershey, the man behind the chocolate, put a 10% deposit on a stateroom ticket, but business interfered and he and his wife caught an earlier boat to New York. J.P. Morgan, so rich he had his own Titanic suite and his own promenade deck. He didn't show, preferring to stay another day at his European resort for a morning massage and sulfur bath. And Anderson Cooper's great-uncle Alfred Vanderbilt canceled last minute, but it went down when a German sub sunk the Lusitania 3 years later. So here's to the real people. Melvina Dean was the final living survivor of the Titanic, who died in 2009 at the age of 97. There are a lot of Titanic videos. For us, researching the names we found in this graveyard brought it home. That they weren't background characters in a movie about an iceberg, a ship, and costumes. That these were real folks with families, fears, hopes, taking action with plans to make their lives better. And in the middle of the night on an exciting trip on this brand new ship, couples were mind-blowingly, unexpectedly split between who would get in the boats and who would die. Entire families, as valuable as yours is today, would finally get to come up on deck and see that there wouldn't be room for any of them. In many cases, they had hours on deck to terrifyingly think about that. Imagine looking at your kids and knowing what's coming. Want to see a couple of real heroes? These are the Strausses, Isidore and Ida, who refused a spot in the lifeboat while there were younger people still waiting to board. And you know they knew they were done for. Malcolm Johnson, third-class passenger, who worked in Minneapolis supervising concrete laying, saving enough money to move back to Sweden and buy a farm. When he got to Sweden, the sale fell through. He was very upset, returning home to America on the Titanic. And finally, Luigi Gotti, picked by the White Star Line to manage the a la carte restaurants. There are reports that during the sinking, the staff was herded into their cabins and kept there. This is the Carpathia bringing the 700 survivors back to New York. We have a wonderful 17-year-old girl from Ontario, Bernice Palmer, to thank for the end of this video. On board, she had this little brownie camera and captured pictures of the Titanic survivors on the Carpathia. A fast-talking middleman business guy got her to sign away the rights to these photos in return for $10. This is a picture of the ice fields the Titanic was rolling through at high speed in the dark, and her picture of the iceberg ran in every paper in the country. Here she is with her camera, which now is in the Smithsonian Institution. The Carpathia arrives in New York and drops off the Titanic lifeboats, then docks at Pier 54 to let out the survivors. These buildings are gone now, The little remnant that's left in New York City is this metal ironwork. It's still there. This is where the Titanic survivors arrived. And if you see it in New York, use your imagination, because the letters can be made out on the ironwork still. The final odd remnant of the Titanic Odyssey.